What if Earth once had an age completely erased from history? Somewhere beneath the weight of a billion dawns, there is a silence that geology cannot name. It rests in the deepest strata, where stone has folded over stone so many times that even the minerals have forgotten what they once were. This is not emptiness. It is erasure, a place where the planet's memory grows thin, where the record falters like a voice losing itself in fog, and where time itself seems to have held its breath for longer than mountains take to rise and fall and rise again. The earth is old, not old the way grandparents are old, nor even old the way rivers carving canyons are old. The earth is old in a way that stretches past imagination, past the reach of human feeling, into spans of time so vast they become a kind of eternity, wearing the mask of numbers. 4.5 billion years of rotation, of cooling, of slow becoming. Hundreds of billions of sunrises have washed across this world, each one arriving and departing without witness, without memory, without any record except the patient chemistry of stone. And yet, within that immense ledger of ages, there exists a chapter that remains almost entirely blank, a gap in the story. A billion years that left almost no trace, as if the planet itself had paused to rest and forgotten to write down what it dreamed. The record dims here. We call it the boring billion, a name that whispers its own mystery. 1 billion years of planetary existence, tucked between more dramatic epochs, during which almost nothing seems to have happened at all. Or perhaps everything happened, and we simply cannot see it anymore. The rocks from this era are sparse, worn, transformed beyond recognition by the slow alchemy of heat and pressure and the endless patience of time. The fossils are faint shadows of single-celled wanderers, impressions so subtle they might be mistaken for patterns in the stone itself. The atmosphere held steady. The oceans kept their secrets. The continents drifted in slow spirals across a world that was waiting for something it could not yet imagine. If the planet remembers, what does it dream about when it dreams of those lost centuries? What color was the dawn over seas that no eye ever witnessed? What currents stirred through waters that would never know the flicker of a fish, the pulse of a jellyfish, the slow glide of anything more complex than a microscopic cell drifting in ancient tides? The questions drift like dust through the vaults of deep time, unanswerable yet strangely comforting. There is peace in not knowing. There is wonder in the gap. There is a kind of rest in the spaces where certainty cannot reach. Tonight, we settle into that gap. We let curiosity become a kind of rest, a meditation on absence, on the spaces between certainties. The light here is pale, the color of limestone and old ice and morning mist over still water. The air hums with the frequency of patience, with the slow vibration of a world that has all the time in existence. And slowly, gently, the erased age begins to reveal not its facts, but its feeling. The texture of a world waiting, the rhythm of a planet breathing slowly in the dark. This is an invitation to drift backward, past the dinosaurs and their thunder, past the first forests rising green toward ancient skies, past the earliest shells and skeletons, into a realm where life was small and quiet, and the continents moved like sleepers turning in an endless night. The story we are about to follow is not a story of events. It is a story of stillness, a story of what might have been, of what was almost forgotten, and of what the silence itself might teach us about the nature of time. Most geologists place this span between roughly 1.8 and 0.8 billion years ago, a stretch formerly known as the Mesoproterozoic and early Neoproterozoic eras. Evidence suggests that during this interval, the planet entered a period of unusual stability, a kind of equilibrium that lasted longer than the entire history of complex life on Earth. The great upheavals that had come before, the formation of continents from molten chaos, the first surge of oxygen into a poisonous atmosphere, the violent reshaping of the crust by impacts and eruptions. all of these had settled into something quieter. The Earth, it seems, was resting. Scientists believe that the supercontinent known as Rodinia dominated much of this age, a vast land mass that drifted slowly across the equatorial regions like a great raft on the gentlest of currents. The word Rodinia comes from the Russian for homeland, and there is something fitting in that name, as if the continents had gathered together to wait, to consolidate, to prepare. The tectonic plates moved, but gently. The rifts and collisions that would later tear the world apart were still hundreds of millions of years in the future, dormant possibilities sleeping in the mantle's heat. The land held still. Geologic records show that oxygen levels in the atmosphere remained relatively low and stable during this time, hovering at perhaps 1 to 10% of modern concentrations. This was enough to sustain the microbial mats that carpeted shallow seas in layers of green and purple, enough to keep the surface waters breathable for the tiny cells that called them home, but not enough to fuel the kind of complex life that would come later. The oceans themselves may have been stratified, with oxygenated surface waters floating above vast depths of anoxic darkness, where different chemistries ruled and different forms of life, if we can call them that, pursued their slow metabolisms in perpetual night. Some researchers propose that the very stability of this era is what makes it so difficult to read. Without dramatic events, there are fewer markers. Without catastrophes, fewer boundaries to measure and name. The rock record from this time is thin because nothing was urgently writing itself into stone. Sediments accumulated in quiet basins. Volcanic activity continued, but without the great outpourings that leave thick layers of ash and basalt for future geologists to measure and date. The planet turned and turned again, and the centuries drifted past like clouds reflecting in water that would never feel the touch of rain. Noon holds steady over green water. The light that fell on those ancient seas would have looked much like the light that falls on seas today, though the sky might have held a different hue, perhaps more orange near the horizon where dust scattered the sun's rays, perhaps hazier with the fine particles of a quieter world. The sun was slightly dimmer then, younger by 1 billion years, but the warmth was enough. Always, the warmth was enough to keep the waters liquid and the chemistry churning in its patient cycles of carbon and oxygen and silicon and iron. Everything waits. Life during this interval appears to have been dominated by single-celled organisms, by bacteria and archaea that had already been thriving for billions of years before the boring billion even began. Evidence suggests that eukaryotes, cells with internal structures and membranes, and the complex machinery that would eventually become the foundation of all plants and animals, existed during this time, but their evolution seems to have slowed to a crawl. The first algae may have drifted through those waters, gathering light in their microscopic bodies, releasing oxygen in whispers too faint to change the world. The first hints of multicellularity may have flickered and faded, experiments that could not sustain themselves in a world not yet ready for complexity. The chemical signature of these rocks tells a story of equilibrium. Carbon isotopes suggest that the cycling of organic matter and carbon dioxide remained steady, without the wild swings that accompanied earlier and later epochs. Sulfur isotopes hint at stable ocean chemistry, at waters that kept their composition century after century, age after age. The great engines of planetary change, volcanism and weathering and biological innovation, all continued to turn, but slowly, in balance, like a pendulum that has found its center and barely moves. And yet, for all this apparent calm, scientists remain puzzled by what was truly happening beneath the surface of this stillness. The boring billion was not boring to the organisms living through it. Each generation of microbes faced its own struggles, its own small triumphs, its own quiet extinctions in the vast anonymity of time. The drama was simply too small, too slow, too diffuse to leave the kind of evidence that later ages would write in bold strokes of bone and shell and the sudden absence of once thriving species. What remains is a mystery wrapped in silence. The data tells us stability, but cannot tell us why. The rocks whisper patience, but do not explain what they were waiting for. And somewhere in that long pause, something must have been preparing. Some threshold must have been approaching. Because after the boring billion ended, after Rodinia began to break apart and oxygen began to rise, the world exploded into complexity with a speed that still astonishes researchers today, as if all that waiting had been gathering something essential, as if the silence had been full of possibility all along. Most geologists agree that the apparent stasis of this era masks processes too subtle for our instruments to fully detect. The Earth was not frozen in amber. It was changing, but in ways that left few traces, in ways that operated below the threshold of geological visibility. Continental drift continued its slow waltz across the equator, carrying microbial mats and stromatolite reefs to new latitudes where they would continue their patient work. Deep within the mantle, convection currents churned with heat from the planet's radioactive core, preparing the forces that would eventually tear Rodinia apart. The magnetic field flickered and reversed, painting invisible patterns in cooling lava, though those reversals are difficult to read in rocks so old and so altered by time. Some studies propose that the stability of the boring billion may have been maintained by a kind of planetary thermostat, a feedback system in which volcanic outgassing and chemical weathering balanced each other so precisely that the climate barely shifted for 1,000 million years. Carbon dioxide would rise, then weathering would accelerate, drawing the gas back into minerals. Weathering would slow, and volcanic vents would restore the balance. If true, this would represent an astonishing feat of self-regulation, a world so finely tuned that it held itself in suspension while generations of stars were born and died in the spiral arms of the galaxy beyond. The balance held. Dusk settles over the ledger of stone. In the fading light, it becomes easier to imagine what the data cannot show. Perhaps the seas of this era were not truly empty, but full of experiments that failed to leave fossils. Soft bodies made of nothing but membrane and chemistry, too delicate to preserve. Structures that dissolved moments after death, leaving no trace of their brief existence. Communities of cells that cooperated for a time, sharing resources and signals, then dispersed back into the single-celled world from which they had briefly emerged. Some researchers believe that multicellular life may have arisen and collapsed multiple times during this interval, each attempt extinguished by environmental pressures we cannot name, each failure erased by the patient work of time. The low oxygen levels may have acted as a ceiling, a boundary that complex life could not cross no matter how many times it tried. Cells need oxygen to grow large, to maintain intricate internal structures, to power the metabolic engines of true complexity. With the atmosphere holding steady at just a fraction of modern levels, evolution may have been trapped in a waiting room, capable of innovation but unable to scale up its innovations into anything that could persist and spread and change the world. The blueprints for animals and plants may have existed in potential, written in the chemistry of those ancient microbes, but the world was not yet ready to read them. And beyond what the data can show, there is room for softer speculation. It may be more honest to imagine that the Earth during this time was not stagnant, but contemplative. A world in the long pause between breaths, gathering itself for what would come. The same wind that had carried volcanic ash in earlier ages now drifted across quieter landscapes, carrying only the fine dust of eroded mountains and the invisible spores of ancient life, seeking new shores on which to settle and begin again. Time exhales. Perhaps the oceans were dreaming. The phrase is not scientific, but it captures something true about the texture of this era, something that numbers and isotope ratios cannot convey. Vast, dark, patient, the waters held their cargo of dissolved minerals and microscopic wanderers, and the slow chemistry of life continued its experiments in the deep. No eye saw those depths. No consciousness registered the passage of centuries, the turning of millennia, the slow accumulation of ages. But something was accumulating in the darkness. Energy, complexity, the raw materials of change. Myths from cultures around the world often speak of world eggs, of cosmic slumbers, of creation stories in which the universe rests before beginning anew. The boring billion is not a myth, but it carries something of that archetype, something that resonates with the oldest stories humans have told about the nature of becoming. A planetary gestation, a long sleep before the waking. The continents drifted like sleepers beneath their blanket of atmosphere, and the cells divided and divided and divided. Each generation a slight variation on the theme, each mutation a tiny step toward something not yet imagined, not yet possible, not yet ready to be born. Some researchers propose that the eventual breakup of Rodinia, which began near the end of this era, released nutrients that had been locked in continental interiors for hundreds of millions of years. Rivers that had barely existed began to flow, carrying minerals to the seas, fertilizing the waters, triggering blooms of photosynthetic life that finally pushed oxygen levels past their ancient threshold. If true, then the end of the boring billion was not an external event imposed upon the Earth, but an emergence from within. The planet had spent 1 billion years preparing its own transformation, like a seed germinating in darkness, until the moment was right to break through the soil. The light pauses. In the space between certainty and imagination, the erased age takes on a kind of presence, not a void, but a veil, not absence, but potential waiting to unfold. The same motifs that opened this journey return now in altered form. The silence that is not emptiness, the stillness that is not death, the gap in the record that is not a failure of the earth to speak, but perhaps a different kind of speech altogether. A language of patience, a grammar of waiting, a syntax written in the slow accumulation of possibility. What if the erasure was not accidental, not in any conscious sense, but in the way that systems sometimes hide their own workings, the way complexity emerges from processes too distributed to observe, too gradual to measure? The boring billion may be the Earth's deepest secret, the interval when the planet was most fully itself, before the drama of complex life imposed its narratives of predator and prey, of extinction and survival, of winners and losers in the great competition for existence. A time when existence was simply existence, without story, without climax, without meaning beyond the slow turning of the days. And in that simplicity, there is something profound, something that speaks to the listener drifting toward sleep, surrounded by the noise of a complex world. The boring billion whispers that complexity is not required, that stillness has its own value, that 1 billion years of quiet is not a waste, but a foundation. Everything that came after, every flower and fish and flying creature, every thought and feeling and dream, all of it rests on that foundation of patience. When stone forgets its shape, does it still remember heat? The question drifts through the mind like sediment settling through water, finding its own level, its own place of rest. We ask it not because we expect an answer, but because the asking itself is a kind of meditation, a way of touching the vastness without being overwhelmed. The boring billion is a mirror held up to human time, and in that mirror, our own lives appear as brief as the flash of a meteor against the patient dark. And yet, there is comfort in the comparison. There is belonging in the recognition. We are made of the same patience. The atoms in our bodies passed through those ancient seas. The oxygen we breathe was first exhaled by microbes that lived and died in waters we will never see, in an age we can barely imagine, in conditions so different from our own that they seem like another universe. The calcium in our bones was once dissolved in Proterozoic oceans, drifting past microbial mats in the pale light of a younger sun. The iron in our blood, the phosphorus in our thoughts, the carbon in every cell, all of it was present during the erased age, waiting in solution or bound in minerals, waiting to be gathered into forms that did not yet exist. We are the descendants of that stillness, the inheritors of that long preparation, the fruit of patience that lasted longer than we can truly comprehend. Oceans rose, continents wandered, time kept breathing. The rhythm of those words approximates something true about the scale of planetary existence, something that escapes us in the rush of daily life with its urgencies and deadlines and demands. We live our lives in moments, in heartbeats, in the rapid flicker of consciousness that makes each second feel so full, so important, so pressing. But the Earth lives in ages. Its heartbeat is measured in the rise and fall of mountain ranges, the slow dance of tectonic plates, the billion-year cycles of carbon and oxygen and stone that turn and turn without hurry, without anxiety, without fear. There is humility in contemplating this scale. Not the humility of insignificance, which is too easy, but the humility of belonging, which is harder and more rewarding. We are small, yes, our lives are brief, but we are woven into the fabric of a story so vast that its beginning is lost in the haze of deep time, and its ending lies beyond the horizon of imagination. The boring billion is part of our inheritance, part of the long becoming that led to the first heartbeat, the first breath, the first moment of wonder when a creature looked up at the stars and asked what they were. The asking is ancient. Perhaps consciousness itself is the planet's way of remembering what it has forgotten. The erased age left few records in stone, but it left its signature in the chemistry of life, in the patterns of evolution, in the deep structures of cells that still carry echoes of those billion patient years in their membranes and molecules and ancient genetic codes. When we wonder about the past, we are the past wondering about itself. When we feel the pull of curiosity, we are feeling the same pull that drew molecules together in primordial seas, the same drive toward complexity that eventually became us. The night deepens now. The light that held steady over ancient waters has faded into memory, and we are left with the soft glow of reflection, the candle-dim illumination of thoughts winding down toward rest. The questions we asked at the beginning remain unanswered, but they feel different now. Lighter, less urgent, less like problems and more like companions. The not knowing has become a kind of knowing, a recognition that mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a texture to be inhabited. The erased age is not a failure of the record. It is an invitation to trust what cannot be seen. Breath by breath, age by age, stone by stone, the story continues. We are here because the earth waited. We dream because the oceans dreamed first. We hold stillness within us because we were born from stillness, and to stillness we will one day return. There is no hurry. There never was. The planet has always known how to wait, and somewhere in our cells, in the ancient chemistry that keeps us alive, we know it too. The veil thins now. The questions that carried us here have grown quiet, settling like dust in an abandoned room, finding their places on surfaces that will hold them gently until someone comes to ask again. The erased age no longer demands explanation. It rests in its own silence, patient as it has always been, holding its secrets without urgency. There is nothing more to solve. There is only the slow fade into rest. The light fades. Somewhere beneath the weight of time, the rocks continue their slow metamorphosis. Minerals shift in darkness. Pressure becomes pattern. Heat becomes crystal. The earth remembers in ways that have nothing to do with words or images, in the language of crystal and heat, in the grammar of tectonics and erosion, in the long sentences of sediment accumulating on ocean floors. The boring billion is not gone. It is folded into everything that came after, hidden in the foundations of the world we know, present in every breath we take, every thought we form, every moment of rest we find. The same wind that drifted over Rodinia drifts now over continents that have split and wandered and collided into new configurations. The same patient chemistry that sustained ancient microbes sustains the cells that make up every living thing. The continuity is unbroken, even if the record is incomplete. We are still inside the story. The story is still becoming. And the silence of the erased age is part of that becoming, a pause that gives meaning to the music that follows, a rest note in the symphony of time. Night settles, the kind of night that is not absence, but presence. The darkness that holds rather than hides, that embraces rather than erases. Stars that were burning during the erased age burn still, though they have aged 1 billion years. Light that left distant galaxies when Rodinia was whole is only now arriving, carrying images of a universe that has already changed beyond recognition. Everything moves, everything waits, everything continues. The darkness deepens. The earth turns, slowly, as it always has. The mantle churns its ancient heat. The seas hold their ancient salts. Somewhere, in the quiet between thoughts, the erased age whispers its only lesson, that there is time enough, that stillness is not emptiness, that even 1 billion years of silence can hold the seeds of everything that follows. The planet breathes. We breathe with it. The rhythm is older than memory. Rest now. And the earth keeps breathing. So do we.